Our scripture reading for this morning comes from Job. We're in the 23rd chapter. We started off at the beginning of the book last Sunday. Today we're up into chapter 23. We're doing verses 1 through 9 and then 16 through 17. Then Job answered, "Today my complaint is bitter. His hand is heavy despite my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him. Then I might come even to his dwelling. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would learn what he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power? No, but he would give heed to me. Then an upright person could reason with me, and I should be acquitted forever by my judge. If I go forward, he is not there, or backward, I cannot perceive him. On my left side, but I cannot behold him. I turn to my right, but I cannot see him. My God has made my heart faint. The Almighty has terrified me. If only I could vanish in darkness, and thick darkness would cover my face." This is the word of God for us as the people of God, and for it we give thanks to God. If you were not here 2 Sundays ago, let me catch you up just a little bit on what has happened. Last week, we didn't meet. We had the community service in Hatton. But 2 Sundays ago, I started to answer a question that has been asked of me in a variety of different ways. And basically it is, what do we do when it seems like God is hiding? Where is God when I can't seem to sense God in the midst of all the craziness that's going on in the world today? So we started off 2 weeks ago dealing with that question, and we're continuing that today. Next week we're going to deal with the issue of depression. That's something that I've been asked a fair amount about in the last couple months or so. With everything that's going on, depression has sort of been on the rise, or at least therapists are seeing a lot more people that are dealing with that. So we're going to talk a little bit about that next week. 2 weeks ago, I started off my sermon by telling a story about a time that I walked out of a seminary chapel service during a difficult time in my life. Now, since I didn't say this 2 weeks ago, let me say now that normally I don't advocate that kind of behavior, but at the time I didn't really see any other way around it. I needed God so badly, and there was no act of the human will that would fix what was broken within me. I knew that I needed God, and I thought the best place that I would be able to find God would be at a seminary chapel service. But like I told you 2 weeks ago, I made it about 5 minutes into the service before I just left. All those people yelling about God being good, all the happy faces, the nice clothes, the cheery music, all of that. But as far as I could tell, no sign of God. And I think that some of you might know what that feels like based on the amount of questions that I've got about this. You may have felt that way at one time or another in your life. And our biblical character for today certainly knew what it felt like. Just in case you weren't listening closely, let's take another look at our passage for today, which is Job chapter 23. And if you look carefully at what we just read, you'll notice that it wasn't that Job was displeased with God's actions. It wasn't that he was angry at the way that God was treating him. The reason that Job was upset was because he couldn't find God anywhere. Like, only if he knew God's address. Then he could march right up to God's front door and give God a piece of his mind. But Job wasn't able to find God anywhere at all. He went forward, he went backward, he went to the left and to the right. But it seemed that God was nowhere to be found. And how do you begin to express your pain and your need for help and your feelings of desolation when you can't even locate the person with whom you need to talk to? What do you do when it feels like God is hiding? Where on earth do you find this God who is supposed to be in control of all these little things in the world, yet at the same time seems so absent in your moment of greatest need? Where is God in moments like that? I was walking out of a chapel service. That's where I left off 2 weeks ago. This is what happened next. That day, at chapel, I was able to find my normal seat, which was right by the aisle, so I didn't have to crawl over anyone to get out. Just turned up, turned around, and focused on getting out the door. I was desperate to get out of that room where there was the music, the smiles on everyone's faces. It was just a bit too much for me. Now, I made it down to a hallway in the chapel, and I just stood there, catching my breath, trying to make sure that I didn't let any tears out. And it was right then that a classmate of mine came barreling around the corner. Now, I don't know what she was doing down there, but I could tell from the moment that she saw me that we were both fairly uncomfortable. But she had seen me. There was no way she could pretend like she hadn't. And she must have felt like she had to say something to me. And the memory is a little bit of a blur, but I think that she patted me on my arm and said, "We all heard what happened at that church that you were at." And then she went on to say, "All I could think of when I heard was, 'There but for the grace of God go I.'" Now, that wasn't a phrase that I'd heard before. I don't think I've heard it since. All I know is that it did absolutely nothing to comfort me. She patted me on my arm, gave me that look of pity, and went up to chapel. And it was well over a month before I ever went back to the chapel on campus again. I had come to find God in desperation because, like Job, wherever I looked, it seemed like God was absent. I had come to a chapel service and wasn't able to find God at all. And when I felt that God's Spirit was absent, I looked out for any indication of God anywhere that I could find. And the comment of that woman in the hallway that day was almost enough to convince me that there was no way I was ever going to find God anywhere. Because it seemed that everywhere I looked, I was just reminded of God's absence, even in the words and the actions of other people. Now, when you read through the book of Job, you'll find that not too long after the portion that we read for today, Job cries over God's absence. He has the same experience. Job was living through some pretty extreme pain in his life. And he receives a visit from a group of friends, and their names are Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and Elihu. Now, they want to be supportive of Job, and they actually do a fairly good job of that until they open their mouths and start to talk, because their words are hurtful and critical. They simply can't move past this idea that because of some sort of cosmic law of judgment, Job deserved all of the pain that he was experiencing, that in some way Job had brought all of this on himself. And what was the response of Job to the quote-unquote help of his friends? As far as I can tell, it just made him think that their God had checked out, indeed, taken a vacation, just when Job needed God the most. And it might be that you've had that same kind of thing happen to you. I would guess some of us had that happen at one point in our lives. And the reason that I say that is because we are all human, and we all fall from time to time. The fact is, when we're confronted with the pain of human life, we sometimes step back in fear, because we know the very same thing could happen to us. And when we step back, we stumble around, trying to do what we can to offer comfort, but we're struggling with our own questions like, is God really out there? Really? Would God abandon me if I were ever in a situation like that? And in our inadequate attempts to offer support, like Job's friends, we sometimes end up saying and doing things that just add to the feeling that God is hiding. But on the other hand, there is something to be said for not being in this all alone, even if the person that's with you can't find the right words of comfort. Remember, we are human, and we do sometimes let each other down. But we can offer something that is valuable for the darkest times in our human lives when we wonder where God is. And what we can offer each other is a tangible experience of the divine. Rabbi Zeman is the rabbi at Temple Beth Shalom in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And he said something shortly after thousands of people in New Orleans and along the Gulf Coast had lost everything in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And his congregation, as well as other houses of faith, had been pushed to the limit, trying to respond to the devastating needs in their city. He said this: "I don't believe that God throws hurricanes at people, or that we can pray them away. Hurricanes are a natural phenomenon in this part of the world. It's not evil because it doesn't have a will. It's a tragedy. But where God is in the way we respond. We are moral beings, and people are God's hands. We see people as God's hands in the world. And speaking to his congregation that day, he said, God's hands are busy working. And that, brothers and sisters, is the key. God is holy. God is divine. God is transcendent. God is other. And no matter how hard we may try, we'll never be able to fully understand the way God works. We won't be able to tangibly experience the presence of God in our darkest moments. As I was saying, God is just so other from us. Better now? How about now? As I was saying, God is so other from us that no matter how hard we try, we can't fully understand the way God works. And it's hard to experience the presence of God in the darkest moments of our lives. But we will be able to reach out and touch another person, to look into someone else's eyes with compassion and love, to feel someone else wiping away a tear that we can't stop, to rest in the embrace of arms when we can't stand up another minute on our own. And it's not the arms, the hands, the fingers, and eyes of a divine transcendent being. It's human hands, eyes, fingers, and arms. But still, they most certainly are evidence that God is here, even if it seems like God is hiding. In 1940, the entire continent of Europe was in pretty desperate times. The strong arm of the Nazi regime was stretching its reach and applying intense pressure as it spread across the continent. It was that year that France came under the rule of the Nazis, and the terror of France took place. At the time, there were around 300,000 Jews living in France. 75,000 of them were sent to their death in the camps. High above the Rhone Valley in France, there was a small little town. It has a name that I'm not even going to pretend to pronounce. But it was at the time, and still is, a very small village, made up of only around 5,000 people. But right after France came under the Nazi rule, the people of that village and the surrounding area found themselves facing a big decision. That Sunday, the village gathered for worship, and they heard their pastor loud and clear when he said, "The responsibility of Christians is to resist the violence that will be brought to bear on this conscience through the weapons of the Spirit." In other words, what he was saying, that what has happened in their country was evil. What was happening to Jews in their country and around the world was evil. And that evil had spread over the continent, and it seemed to cover everything in thick darkness. And people were left wondering where God was. Now, I'm going to stop for just a minute. Vicky, now it's even okay. Go and get me a glass of water, please. I'm starting to get a... Okay, thank you. Now, it's important to remember that for these villagers, they were not risking evil because they were all Protestant Christians. But at that time, everyone in the community decided that as representatives of God, they had to start a strong and forceful conspiracy of goodness in the face of pure evil. That's exactly what they did. Every member of that community welcomed Jews from all over France to live with them, and they hid their Jewish friends from the Nazis. They resisted in the face of violence and threats. They refused to give in to the hopelessness in the eyes of the Jews they took in, who had begun to think that God was hiding, or that God might actually not exist at all. And that community effort was so strong that finally the local police were forced to participate in the raids to arrest Jews. But they would make it a point to go to a local cafe for lunch and talk quite loudly about where the next raid would take place, which gave time for their friends to go and hide their Jewish guests so that they could honestly report that they found no Jews in the raid. But more than that, the people of France, thank you. But more than that, the people of this village opened their homes and their hearts to a people who were all alone, that were in despair, convinced that God didn't care for them at all. They took them in, they fed them, they welcomed them into their own families. And by the end of the war, it was estimated that over 5,000 Jews had passed in safety through that little village. All of them were saved from death. All of them were saved from the fear that evil was ruling the day. All of them were saved from the thought that God was gone, hiding, so far away that God would never be found. And they knew that by having a safe place to sleep, by receiving a grateful hug, by spending an afternoon with a real live person, who stood in the gap of silence until God could be found again. Now it's true, brothers and sisters, that sometimes people let us down. Sometimes we say and do the wrong thing at the wrong time when we feel alone and we feel cut off from God. But sometimes, actually quite often, we see God in the faces of those who walk beside us, just when the darkness seems to take over and we can't quite see which way to go next. Someone holds out a hand to help us along. And it's a human hand, not the actual presence and perfection of a divine, transcendent being, but tangible, warm, comforting reminder of God's presence. It was later that week, the same week that I had left that chapel service, surrounded by the darkness, not knowing what to do, that Vicky and I received a knock at our door one night. Now, we had no idea who would be at our door. I didn't think that anyone from the church that I had just left would want to talk to me, since I wasn't their pastor anymore. And other than members of that church, we really didn't know anyone in that community. But at the door stood a woman from the very first church that I had served. Not the one that I had just left, but the very first church that I had served as pastor to in Missouri. She said that she was traveling, and that she had heard what had happened to me, and she just wanted to visit for a bit. So we ushered her into our living room, and we started talking about her work and what was going on with her family. But then she asked about us, and saying that she had heard what had happened and wanted to know if it was really true. And she wanted to remind us that even though we had no family nearby, the nearest family members were about 7 hours away at the time, and since we had no church family at the moment, since we had just left that community, to remind us that we were not alone, and that we could call her if we ever needed anything. And then she left to go home. But I'll never forget that night. I'll never forget the face of a woman that I had not talked to in months, who I had not been a pastor to in months. At that time, I technically wasn't a pastor to anyone at all. I'll never forget her stepping into a place that others might have found uncomfortable, not to solve a problem or fix something, but to remind us that we were not alone. The 20 or so minutes that she spent with us in our living room that night was enough to remind me of that. That even though I felt God was hiding, God was most definitely there. She reminded me. I'm sure that there is someone in your life right now who cannot feel the presence of God. No matter how hard they try, they can't feel God's presence in the situations that they might find themselves living in. For them, God is hiding. So this week I would challenge us to be like the people of Temple Beth Shalom, to be like the people in the small village in France, to be the hands and feet of God in this world. Because we can remind each other that God is here. That God is here, even if it seems like God is completely and totally absent. So this week, do something to reach out to someone like that. Someone who may feel that at this time in his or her life, that God is nowhere to be found at all. And you can keep your distance. You can do this from your own home if you want to. Take a few moments to write a note, to make a phone call, even if it's through the gift of technology. Send an email or a Facebook message. On behalf of the divine, be a tangible expression of the promise that God will never leave us, that God will never forsake us. And if you are the person who looks out over your life and the darkness is surrounding you, and you can't seem to find God no matter how hard you might yell, or you can't get a sense of God's presence, it could be time for you to reach out as well. Just reach out to the person that's parked next to you. Pick up the phone. Make a phone call. When it seems like God is hiding, reach out and feel the presence of another human being. And just for that moment, we can be, for each other, the very presence of God. And for that gift, I say thanks be